Hello, everyone. This is Doug Hadaway at Hadaway Communications. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Hopefully, you're seeing on your screen the title of today's presentation, Strategic Storytelling for Federal Agencies. We're going to be sharing insights and ideas from work that we've been doing for the Ford Foundation, along with the Office of Management and Budget, and how to talk about community-led partnerships, or what is often known as place-based work. As many of you know, this is a follow-up to the training on delivering outcomes for communities, which was sponsored by OMB. And we'd like to thank OMB for including us as part of this community of practice and sharing what we've been learning about this issue and sort of the art and science of strategic storytelling. We were brought into this by the Ford Foundation, which wanted to help share best practices and innovations being used by federal agencies to create positive change in communities across the country. And the foundation asked us to conduct research to help lift up the lessons being learned in a variety of communities and develop a guidebook to help you communicate with both the public and practitioners in government about the value of this work and how it's done. And we've worked with our colleagues at OMB throughout this process. In this webinar, I'll share the lessons of that research, as well as the science of strategic storytelling. Ellie Sandemeyer, who you heard a moment ago, was one of the lead researchers on this project. She'll be joining me at the end to answer any questions that you might have. Before we dive into the content, just wanted to tell you a little bit more about us. Hadaway Communications is a strategic communications firm based in Washington, D.C. We deliver research-driven strategy, content, and campaigns for clients in government, as well as philanthropy, nonprofits, and business. And we have a mission, which is to help visionary leaders and organizations achieve ambitious goals that benefit people on the planet. And this work that you do is very much aligned with our mission. We're very proud and happy to be part of it. And integral to our approach is using science to inform communications. So today we'll be sharing insights from social and cognitive psychology, linguistics, and other fields to show you some of the thinking and the theories behind the messages and strategies that we're recommending for this. So what you'll learn today is guiding principles and tools to help you create research-based storytelling strategies. And as I said, some of the science behind this style of communication, and also obviously the content messages that we're recommending for how to talk about place-based approaches. Most of you probably have this guidebook, either having picked it up at the conference or downloaded it from the email that you received. I'll be referring to this and as we go along, showing excerpts and referring to it by page number. So if you have it handy, it might be useful to keep it on hand as we go through the presentation. So we'll start with some science. And this image on your screen, which we call the aspirational communication model. And what it does is capture some of the science, particularly brain science, behind communicating with maximum motivating power. And what it says is that in order to raise interest in a topic and engagement, get people wanting to learn more and get involved in a cause or learn more about an issue, we need to communicate with them at multiple levels. And it starts with the aspirational. It starts with their aspirations for their lives. What are they hoping for themselves, their family, their community, their country? That's what drives people's behavior, is their aspirations for their lives. So when we start there by understanding how our topic connects to their hopes for their own lives, we'll be starting in a place that's meaningful to people. It'll be relevant to them. They'll care about it. And we'll show you what we mean by that in an example in just a moment. The next level says social, and there's really a lot to learn from social psychology and how people and groups interact that inform how we communicate. When people are trying to wrap their head around a cause or take a position on an issue or join an organization or decide to vote for a candidate, any kind of decision like that, one of the first things they do is look for what the psychologists call social cues. Who else is already involved with this cause? Who supports that candidate? Who is doing this work that you're trying to get me to support or get involved with? So we always want to put people in the picture to help people quickly see the people behind a cause, see others behind the cause, and hopefully see themselves in it in some way. And again, make it more relevant to their life. And then there's the emotional level. And what the brain science says is that emotion works with cognition. It's part of thinking. Emotional reactions drive attention and retention and motivation. So communications need to create emotional reactions in people, no matter what the topic is, or they're not going to notice it concerning how much they're bombarded with information all day. They're not going to notice your communication unless it creates an emotional reaction or remember it, much less be moved to act. So emotion is an important piece. And then the last level you see there we call the functional level. This is messages about what things do. How does a program work? What benefit does it provide to people? And when we're trying to explain government policies and programs, we need to keep it really simple at the level of describing what it does and how it works. One of the biggest dangers is actually overwhelming people with too much information or complexity. We'll go into the science behind that and show you examples as we go through the presentation. So this is a lot to accomplish, to communicate at all these levels. The way to do that most effectively and efficiently is through narrative. That's why this is called strategic storytelling. And narrative is a hot topic in marketing and communications, even in politics. We hear that word used a lot in this town in DC. What we define it in a very practical way. We use a narrative framework to organize messages about any topic. And you see that on your screen, a simple framework that starts with the people. Who are the people involved in this program or issue or cause we're talking about? What are their goals? So you can see already we're putting people in the picture and talking about their aspirations. What are they hoping for in connection to this topic? What problems are they encountering? And then our solutions are what you bring to the table. What is your program? What does your policy bring to the table that helps people overcome challenges and achieve the goals that are meaningful to them? So as you can see, when we communicate this way, we're starting with what really matters to people and then connecting our work to it so that it's relevant to them and meaningful. And of course, when we get people's interest and engagement, we want to have a call to action. We want to have something that they can do to support the cause. And that's why that says call to action. There's best practices about how to do each one of these things, how to talk about people and goals and problems and solutions. There's a lot of science behind it, but we'll just show you a few excerpts as we go along, a few examples. But to show you an example of how this works, we were asked by the Ford Foundation to develop a narrative about programs that help people get out of poverty. And the work that we did was used by the Ladders of Opportunity initiative in the administration to develop its messages about that initiative and all the programs involved in it. And here's how we populated that narrative framework. First, these programs serve people who are working hard to get ahead, people who are trying to stand on their own 2 feet and lift themselves out of poverty. And what research showed us, it was really critical for taxpayers and others to understand that people who are served by anti-poverty programs are doing their part in trying to do their best to get out of poverty. And what's their goal? Like any of us, their goal is financial security. And that's seen through having a home and an education and being able to send your kids to school and having a secure retirement. What's the problem that's addressed by anti-poverty programs? As you know, those are complex issues. There are a lot of factors that go into poverty. But the way that people understood it intuitively in a way that made them relate to the issue was understanding that many people in this country start out in life without opportunities because their families really don't have enough to make ends meet. So what do our programs in this realm do in the poverty space. They provide tools that help everyone earn a good living and save for the future. And that frame of tools that help people earn and save framed a whole variety of programs that help people get out of poverty. So you can see it's a very high level framework that you can use to enter a conversation with people who don't know anything about the topic in a way that they can relate to. And then it can open the door for you to explain more and start showing how different programs work and what they do for people. This is meant to begin a conversation, not try to explain every last detail. But what we do is take that framework and then create a narrative and what we're calling a 1 minute message, something you can say literally in about a minute. As you can see here, this is that narrative that flowed from that anti-poverty framework that has people and goals, people across the country striving to make a better life for themselves and their families, don't have the opportunity to achieve financial independence and long-term security. And then we fleshed out the problem further in the second paragraph, that jobs don't pay enough, policies aren't necessarily addressing the problem, and so forth. And then the solution, proven tools that help everyone save. And then there's a couple bullets as examples. And that list can get pretty long. As I said, this was used to talk about dozens of programs. And what we did, when we have a narrative framework, we can develop messages using these ideas in this language on lots of different topics. And every message we tested using this framework tested like this. 7 out of 10 Americans found them convincing reasons to support government anti-poverty programs. So the approach can be very effective if you get it right. And that, as you know, comes down to execution. What's the language we're using? What kind of stories are we telling? So what we'd like to do is show you how, using that approach of a narrative framework, we developed a research-based narrative to help you talk about community-led partnerships. We started with research in the field to understand how these partnerships work. What are people doing, and how are they doing place-based work? As you can see on the screen, we did that through interviews with government innovators and local leaders across the country in rural and urban and suburban areas to explore how the partnerships work and also show how to talk about the federal government's role in it. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of what we heard from people. This is a good one. Rather than the old model of urban renewal where government comes in with bulldozers, we want the city to articulate their vision and strategic priorities. So we say, here's where federal programs can assist. Another one. The bottom line is it's got to be community-driven, community-led. All we have to do is partner with them to reach their goals. You can see right there a technique. We heard people talking about it. They said it's community-led partnerships. That's really where that idea came from for that phrase, to replace place-based, which is a rather abstract idea to most people. This has the benefit of emphasizing the idea that leadership and participation comes from the local level, and that your role is to partner and work together with people. Another quote is brought up some important ideas. It's easy for this work to seem touchy-feely or like a luxury, but at the end of the day, this leverages resources better and changes the way we can impact communities. For us, this is a necessity. That was somebody from HUD. And what this quote speaks to is efficiency, efficient use of resources, and effectiveness, impact on communities. And that's those are important themes to include as we talk about it, supported by research from the Center for American Progress, which showed a majority of Americans want efficient and effective government. That's what they're looking for, much more than they're looking for government to be smaller. They want it to be efficient and effective. So with those sorts of insights from 45 different conversations with people working in the field, we suggested this name to call this approach community-led partnerships, and came up with this framework. The people who are involved in community-led partnerships begin with local residents who know their community's needs and strengths and what they want. What is their aspiration? A great place to live, work, and raise a family. It's really important to start here with really basic things like this because this is what gets people interested and motivated because that's why they're getting involved. They're getting involved because people like them are involved and because it's achieving goals that are meaningful in their lives. Problem. As you know, these are complex issues, but what we focus on is top-down approaches and red tape. Top-down approaches that don't take local realities into account, and red tape that makes it harder for people to create change. And then the solutions, government innovators, people in government who work side by side with community leaders and build customized strategies that directly meet local needs. So that's a framework and the big ideas that people found most compelling to start a conversation about community-led partnerships. So then we turn this into a 1-minute message, which you can see on page 3 of your guidebook. Starts again with people and goals. Local residents know what their communities need in order to be great places to live, work, and raise a family. They know the strengths. And then you can see it goes into problems and solutions, and it fleshes out further those concepts that we mentioned in the narrative framework there. And as I said, a purpose of this narrative is really to raise interest, to talk to people who aren't experts in this about it in ways that they'll understand, but also be interested in and motivate them. And what we want to do here, what we're doing is just using familiar language to talk about it and to focus on the benefits of it. It's hands-on, it's responsive, it's customized. Also on page 3, you'll have what we call an elevator pitch, just sort of a quick one-liner that you can say about this to start a conversations. Community-led partnerships are a proven approach to regional revitalization in which local residents lead the vision for the future, leads the way. Government innovators collaborate across agencies to cut red tape, streamline programs, and offer hands-on help to craft holistic strategies that make communities great places to live, work, and raise a family. So there, again, we're emphasizing the benefits of this approach: cut red tape, streamline programs, offer hands-on help, which is very tangible to people. And the idea that what we're coming up with are comprehensive, strategic approaches to improving communities. So moving on from there, the next part of the content that we provided is about the players, because it is so important to put people in the picture the right way. And that's an important rule of thumb we wanted to share from the science. Put people in the picture when you're trying to explain just about anything. Describe problems, describe policies, describe programs in terms of people and what they do. To show you the science behind that, this is from cognitive psychology, understanding how people process information and interpret the world. Our minds make sense of situation by creating stories of people acting with intention to achieve outcomes. This is how we have been hardwired as humans to understand our world, because we learn our language, we learn our values, and we learn how the world works through stories we're told. And we're always looking for the people who are trying to make something happen. So to show you an example of that, it seems so basic because it is. It's fundamental to the way we think. And what we're doing is borrowing from those insights to structure our communications in the way that people understand things. So here's an example. The Ford Foundation had asked us to develop a narrative about the financial crisis in 2009. And an analysis of the conversation showed that it was being blamed on consumers who got mortgages. And the foundation's grantees were supporting financial reforms and consumer protection laws. So we had to change that narrative. And so what we did was reframe the problem by putting people in the picture. In this case, different people. It wasn't consumers, it was fast-talking mortgage brokers and Wall Street speculators who caused this problem. And what did they do? They took advantage of weak consumer protections, ineffective regulation, and poor transparency to deceive people and hide risk. So what you can see happening there, there's the science of it. Somebody doing something, an actor acting with agency and intention. And that, of course, is a very simple human way to begin a conversation about the financial system, what went wrong, and what needs to be fixed. And you can see the solutions are embedded in that second paragraph. The Ford's grantees were working to promote consumer protections, better regulation, and greater transparency. And when we're talking about government, you don't often see people in the picture. In fact, if you Google government and look at the images that come up, this is what you see. Most of the images you see when you Google the word government are pictures of buildings or gavels. So what's coming up, and I think top of mind for people too, is about abstract, remote institutions and abstract concepts, not people. So if we want people to understand and support the work that you do, you want them to see it like this. You want them to see it in human terms, as people working together. That's why we've provided this content about the players. And if you look on page 10 of your guidebook, you'll see that we've named each of the players in the process and described what each one does so that you have language to work with. Local leaders launch the effort with support from federal partners who are innovators and work across agencies and look for the best way to meet local needs. Local government officials who bring experience and help target federal resources. Local business owners who see the opportunity and invest and get involved because they see the opportunity to create jobs and catalyze economic activity. Nonprofit, faith, and community organizations who also bring resources to the table and know-how. And people in the community, local residents, become part of these efforts. When we talk to people across the country about how this works, these are the people, these are the players they talked about. The next section is about the principles. So what are these people doing? How does this work? We phrase these in terms of principles that can be applied in many different situations. It's complicated work. There's a lot going on. So it's really important that we keep it simple, and wanted to bring some more science to the fore and give you another rule of thumb to guide you when you're talking about, not just about this, but any government program or policy. You need to keep it simple, and you need to avoid using language that people don't understand. And you probably know I'm talking about jargon. Jargon is probably the biggest obstacle to effective communication between people who are experts in a topic and people who aren't. Jargon kills comprehension, retention, and motivation. If you're using words that people don't understand, they won't understand you, they won't remember, and they won't be moved to act. So it's a big problem. And jargon is defined as a specialized vocabulary that's used by people who are trained in a certain field. So by definition, if people weren't trained in your field and taught the language that you use, they literally won't understand what you're saying. So it's really important to use familiar language, use words that people understand. And that, of course, is audience dependent. If you're talking to a group of fellow experts, use all the jargon you want. That's what it's for. But as soon as you go outside that circle, you need to think clearly about the audience and translate that jargon. Here's the science, some of the science behind it. Studies demonstrate an inverse relationship between semantic, visual, and conceptual complexity and the perceived credibility of the information conveyed, which is jargon. What that means is people are more likely to trust information they easily understand. And this is called fluency theory. What it says is that when people can process information without much effort, if they can easily understand what you're saying, it's not just that they understand it, they also trust it. They're more likely to trust what you're saying. And that's a really important insight. Complexity makes it hard to understand, and it also breeds distrust. You've heard the phrase, read the fine print, or the fast-talking salesman is trying to pull the wool over your eyes. Those are common expressions of this idea that complexity is something to be suspicious of. So to show you an example, I'd go back and actually make one more point. This fluency theory says semantic, visual, and conceptual complexity. So that means the words You need to use words that are familiar and simple. Visual information, it works there too. If your infographics are too complicated, they won't work and in fact will confuse and raise distrust. And conceptual complexity. Don't try to throw too many concepts or ideas at people all at once. That's again back to why we create a simple narrative framework to start a conversation like this. So this is really important in almost every form of communication. So to give you an example, this is from the field of public health, which we do a lot of work in. This is from a message meant for the general public. It says effective care for mother and baby at this time also reduces maternal mortality and intrapartum stillbirths, resulting in a triple return on investment. So what this message is trying to do is encourage people to support investments in what's called maternal mortality. So if you're not a public health expert, you probably know that your jargon's showing up here in the red. And it's a simple matter. One of the lessons we want to convey here is you don't have to quote dumb things down, right? You can communicate the very same idea using familiar language. So there's our jargon. Translate reduces maternal mortality to saves mothers' lives. Intrapartum stillbirth, what's it mean to reduce that? It keeps babies alive during birth. Triple return on investment, that's business lingo. It means you save 3 times as much money as it costs. And all we've done is simply translate the jargon into familiar language. And as you can see, it hasn't changed the meaning of the message. So that's something you can do in your work every day. Really keep a sharp eye out for jargon if your message is for the general public or a non-expert audience. So that's one watchword we had in mind as we developed messages about these principles, which you'll find on page 4 of your guidebook. And basically, as you can see, starting up there in the blue in the upper corner, it says local leadership. That's really how it begins, with local leadership and authentic community conversations where people get together to talk about what they want for their community, and forming productive partnerships within the community and across federal agencies, setting concrete goals, using evidence to create our strategies, having a clear structure of decision making so that you can execute on it. Having a positive narrative was an interesting and important idea, that people need to have a vision for what's possible in their community in order to be motivated. And the multiplier effect is the term that we're using for the impact, because what we heard from people doing this work across the country is that it has many outcomes. There are lots of ways that you have impact. So you want to convey that and understand the different ways that this work impacts a particular community. So you'll see in your guidebook that there are descriptions, language that describes each of these principles in a sentence or so, as well as examples of those principles at work on the ground across the country. And those are on pages 5 through 9 in your guidebook. So what we provided there is content, building blocks, language that you can draw from to write speeches or press releases or web content or any kind of content you need to create for communications with people you are trying to introduce to the concept of place-based work or community-led partnerships. So then we thought we would share ideas for how to build a storytelling strategy. Storytelling is what we mean by going from this narrative framework where we've pulled together these ideas and language to talk about them, and then tell stories about specific people in specific places doing specific things that bring it all to life. How you tell stories about what your program or agency is doing. And as you know, strategic storytelling is going to begin with a clear understanding of the audience and purpose. That's what we mean by strategic. You understand you have a goal for this, you understand who the audience is and what you're trying to accomplish by communicating with them. So first think through what is the goal. I think that comes through in the vision. What is the vision of the program or the project that you're working on? And then who can help you achieve it? When you're thinking of audience, that's really the strategic question to ask. Who has a role in helping us achieve our goal? And can you articulate what that role is? That's a good exercise to go through, because sometimes if you can't really articulate a role for a particular uh, audience segment or member, maybe they're not a priority for you. What we have here is the players give you ways to think about your audience for those you want to engage in this kind of work. What can they do? Those are our principles. When it comes to talking about this kind of work, the principles give you ideas and language for how to talk about what people can do as part of this. So that gives you a strategic framework and helps you start thinking about your own storytelling and how to frame up stories that will connect with your particular audiences. So to show an example, we, on page 16 in the guidebook, we have a story about Fresno, California, which we've sort of annotated. On your screen is just a quick excerpt from that, in which we've shown uh, the vision, rebuilding downtown and achieving economic revitalization. That was sort of the vision and the goal here. The players in this story are the mayor and a government innovator. And these are the principles at work. They were building the community's confidence. That's an example of the positive narrative. And it was really an important part of this story, that people in Fresno were excited by the vision, the idea that they could have a vital, vibrant downtown. And then, of course, $65 million of private investment is pretty impressive impact. And that, in the principles, is in the category of multiplier effect. There are multiple impacts. We just picked this one in this excerpt as one example of the kind of impact it had. So that's an example of just one excerpt showing vision, vision, players, and principles. And story, and I just wanted to point out that the boxes in orange next to the text are those principles. And what we've done is point at the principles that we used here, and we didn't use all of them. And that's something I'd just wanted to note, that you can look at this content of players and principles as a toolkit. I think it'd be kind of exhaustive to try to use every player and every principle and every story. It's not going to work that way. It really depends on the particular story you have to tell. So just look at it that way. This is a flexible sort of toolkit. And then the boxes in blue are actually show you the elements of a story map that we use to create compelling stories that will draw a reader in and keep them engaged. And this, I'm going to show you that map in a second, but just want to tell you about it first. There's been research done across cultures around the world about how people tell stories. And it was found that there's actually a common structure to the way stories are told that are aligned with the ways our attention and retention and motivation work in our brains. And when you tell a story in this order, in this way, people are going to be compelled to listen and want to hear what happens. It's an interesting formula that's actually used by Hollywood filmmakers to make movies. It's called The Hero's Journey, from an anthropologist called Joseph Campbell. And what we've done is created a simple version of it to create stories for programs like these and for different causes that our clients work on. And we call it a social impact story map. And if you can start on the right side, step one is where you're putting somebody in a situation which you show their status quo. What's the situation? Fresno has a deteriorating downtown. That's the status quo. But people's eyes are open to the possibilities. There are doubters. Some people wonder if you could ever get this downtown moving again. But solutions emerge. People have ideas. Local leaders, government innovators have ideas. So they take the first steps. Of course, anytime you get started, you're going to encounter challenges and obstacles. And allies join the cause. It's really interesting if you look right here how this story map really works well in talking about community-led partnerships, because it really does reflect what happens on the ground. People come together and figure out how to overcome these challenges together. And so they take action and breakthroughs happen. Problems get solved. Progress gets made. and ultimately lives are changed and there are lessons that can be shared. So what we've done is show you those steps in this story map and how that story on page 14 is structured to make it a compelling story that someone's going to be inclined to listen to. And on page 14 through 42, you have a series of stories from around the country that essentially draw on this content and this structure to create content. If you're interested in this storytelling map and storytelling in general, we'd recommend this website. It's called hatchforgood.org, as in hatch an idea. And this is a platform that we created with support from another foundation that wanted to share the science of strategic storytelling with social impact organizations, government, nonprofits, social enterprises, and so forth. And it'll walk you, it has a series of lessons or toolkits that walk you through the process of outlining a strategy, developing a narrative framework, looking at what platforms you can use to engage with audiences, and even evaluation, how you can evaluate how you're doing. And you'll also see lots of case studies and stories there with examples of people putting best practices to work. So we thought you'd be interested and love to hear from you if you find that to be a useful tool. So we wanted to end this part of the conversation with this quote because we thought it was an inspiring message from someone who's been working on this in California. It absolutely motivates me to do good work because I know what good work looks like at a ground level. That's from Susan Haig at the California Strategic Growth Council. She's talking about the work itself of being part of a community-led partnership, but it's also, we think, about the message and about the storytelling. It will have the same effect on people. If you do it well, they'll get an idea, they'll get a good idea of how this looks on the ground and be motivated to get involved with it. So we'll stop there and open up the floor to questions, and Ellie will tell you how to do that.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So at the top of your screen, you have a little icon with a bubble. If you just click on that, you'll be able to enter some questions through the chat, and I will read those and we'll address them. I'll give you all just a minute to type in your questions, and then we will get started with some answers.
Comments are welcome too. If you'd just like to comment on anything you heard, we'll share those as well.
All right, we're starting to get some coming in. What are some best practices for teaching folks like grantees and local partners how to do this? We work with many, and our telling good stories is a challenge when we're far apart. That's a really great question. I think a lot of it kind of goes back to the basics that Doug was talking about earlier. When we did this research, we spoke with a lot of individuals about who are doing this type of work from Washington, or managing a bunch of different communities or managing a region, and really have to build these big coalitions or work across agencies, across silos, and struggle to make sure that they're targeting their audiences in the right way. I think what it really does come down to is what Doug was saying about putting people in the picture. And that's the insight that we kept coming back to with research. I think when you can show how your motivations are aligned with the aspirations of the community, and that the work you do is really tied in with their goals, you just get so much more of a response. people are so much more engaged in work. Um,
The question here is about best practices for teaching grantees and local partners how to do this. And as Ellie was alluding to, getting them engaged in mapping out their own story is an important first step. A lot of people, the science says our brains sort of interpret the world through stories, but that doesn't mean everybody's a natural storyteller. But when people learn the basics like this framework we showed, it's so simple and it does click pretty quickly. And then help people map out their own story first. They need to go through the process, and what Ellie and Eliana, her colleague who interviewed everybody, they just asked people their stories and drew it out of them, and then produced this content from that. So I think that's an important first step. You have to engage people in that piece of it. And then all the work we do with government agencies or grantees, it really is important that you have a conversation, give them hands-on guidance and help in doing it, rather than just distributing materials, because that's pretty abstract. And it's often hard for people to take a guide like this and just do it without at least getting a briefing like this, but even better to get a workshop or hands-on help. We have presented this on a webinar the other day, and also at a presentation or at a conference, that conference that many of you went to. And a number of people have reached out to us to have workshops with their offices and agencies, and we're happy to do that. I think that's an important piece of it. Take content like this and then give people an experience where they can come together and with some expert guidance, start to flesh out their own story.
Great. We also have a question. Have you seen this work with political representatives? That's a really great question.
I'm wondering, when you say seen this to work with political representatives, either storytelling as a communications technique or whether communicating in this way persuades political representatives. So I'll answer it in both ways. We actually help develop a manual for managers of political campaigns and how to develop messages that really use this framework. And a lot of good politicians are actually natural storytellers. So it is part of that world. In terms of whether communicating in this way is persuasive to political representatives, the answer is yes. They are persuaded just like everybody else is. You can open their eyes to issues and the value of different programs and so forth through telling stories. And I think our message on this is to be strategic about the stories you tell. If you tell the story in the wrong way, you can actually do damage to your cause and shoot yourself in the foot. So for example, the anti-poverty narrative, which we showed you earlier as an example, what our research showed was you need to begin a story like that by showing that people who benefit from these programs are taking initiative and doing things to stand on their own 2 feet. They're getting job training or taking their kid to Head Start and then going off to a financial literacy class. Whatever it is, they need to be doing something. But often people who work to fight poverty put those players in a different light and position them as victims of circumstance, and go for sort of a sympathy play, which is important. Of course, you feel sorry for people who are in poverty, but in fact, the research shows that that was less motivating. So that's just one example of doing the storytelling strategically. Figuring out what's the best way to do it is an important piece of this.
Great. We get another question. What strategies can we use when the breakthrough is a process improvement, i.e. planning, and not yet a tangible outcome? I think this is a really important thing, and this is something that my colleague Eliana and I have been talking about a bunch lately. I think a lot of what we saw at the beginning of this project when we were trying to wrap our heads around how place-based initiatives are and what kind of stories or how place-based initiatives work, what they are, and what kind of stories are already being told, was that we a lot of the stories that are out there kind of naturally go towards a plot-driven format. They're about, here is an initiative, here's what it's trying to do, what's the impact, which is a really important story to tell. But sometimes when you have a new initiative, you're not always able to tell that impact story. And I think that's really where character-driven stories come in. Those can be compelling in totally different ways. And there are a lot of opportunities to show, say, as we showed in the guide, where we have a couple of stories like that, that a government worker coming into a community that is predisposed to be skeptical about government, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, that. And then, that government innovator realizing that the way they had been doing their work wasn't necessarily aligned with the community's needs, or there were ideas coming from the community members that maybe his office hadn't considered. And then completely, building this relationship and changing the whole conversation about the type of work they're doing, and changing their plan. I think those can be also very compelling. It's just about, thinking about the kind of story your audience needs to hear. And you can use these tools, both the principals and the players, to focus in on different elements that may be interesting to highlight.
Yeah, I think you'll motivate people to get involved in this work just by telling stories about people coming together to address a challenge in their community. That's a story worth telling, even if they haven't solved the problem and achieved impact yet, because it's opening people's eyes to this approach, and also motivates more people to want to learn more and get involved in things like this. And that social impact story map is interesting because as you start to plot out your program or your story, particular story using this, you might often see that you get part of the way around and you're just not to impact yet. That's fine. Because one of the goals in communicating about it is just open people's eyes to the approach. And I think one of the challenges we have is people don't see government as people working with others to solve problems. So you're really moving the ball forward in terms of public understanding and public opinion, even if you tell stories about this even before you get to impact.
So the next question, how do you suggest discussing suggestions and revisions with higher level officials who want to make alterations to stories written in this format but don't understand the process? That can be tough.
Take the training.
Other than to take the training. That can be tough. And I think that's, that's something that you work with anytime you're working with an editor. I think a really helpful thing is to just have the strategy laid out really well, and kind of know the key elements and the key pieces and how you're working to be able to articulate that.
Yep. So we start with trying to educate senior management about the science behind the storytelling. So that's one reason we gave you a couple of those scientific insights, because people need to understand, for example, if the senior manager crosses out a familiar word and replaces it with jargon, you could point out that our audience aren't experts, they won't understand jargon, and they'll stop reading this. So to have reasons and be able to articulate the reasons behind the language, for example, I think if you frame this first by saying that your content is based on research, can help, because a lot of times people in that position are they're bringing lots of frameworks to the table, but don't realize the strategic thinking or research or science behind what they're looking at. And I know that can be hard to get time on the agenda to go through that. Maybe you could do a cover memo. You send something to someone that points that out. You could send them an excerpt, draw from this guidebook. But just framing it up first so that they understand the thinking behind it, I think would probably help a lot in those situations.
I think that fits in pretty well with the next question, which says, when writing the story, do you find it best to have all players in the room while you actively write? For me, and I think the way that we work as a collaborative communication organization, is that it's really important to have those conversations up front and get everybody on the same page, maybe not necessarily about the content, but about the strategy, about what you're focused on and what you're going for, and then maybe take a step back and do the fleshing out.
Yeah, if you are working with several other people in your agency or other agencies, I could see how you could get people together or on a call and just try to flesh out a narrative framework. We do that with groups all the time. So you've got that narrative framework that we showed you. Is it in the guidebook?
It is.
What page?
Actually, it's not, the
You can use
graphic
the
is
story
not
map.
in the
Yeah.
guide, but we do have the elements of that and the narrative.
So maybe the story map. If you got people together and said, hey, let's map out this story together, you would get ideas from people about different players and what's happening. And it goes back to the idea of engaging people in the process of developing the story. You're going to have more people bought in. You're going to probably have a more holistic idea of of the players and the principles at work than you would if you did it by yourself. So we find it is really helpful to start this with a conversation and get people's ideas on the table, rather than writing something and then passing it around for editing. And that does tap into people's sort of storytelling sort of DNA. So I think that could be helpful in sort of generating content like this.
Yeah, I think it could be really, you could potentially come up with the type of short kind of 1 or 2 line story that we talked about earlier in Fresno, and then build it out to that longer narrative, like we illustrated. So the next question, do you think telling the after story is also important, such as a project is finished, and what happened 6 months or a year later?
Yep, that refers to sharing lessons and talking about impact. So the answer is yes. Back to that social impact story map on page 13, that's step 4. And it's a great idea because ultimately, if you think about stories are about lessons, right? You hear a tale and you're compelled by characters and what they do and what obstacles they overcome. But almost every memorable and meaningful story has a lesson. So you absolutely want to share the lessons that are learned and tell. I like the idea of the after story. How's that community doing now? Particularly here, where you have the multiplier effect and you have lots of different outcomes. That means lots of different stories that can be told about impact on people's lives, economic impact. One of my favorite stories in this work is about coal miners in Kentucky learning to become computer coders. And so far, the story is mostly about people coming together to provide that training. And it would be great to hear the stories later about companies that were started by these coal miners, jobs that they got, how their families are doing now that they're coders, that sort of thing. I think that's a great idea.
Great. So it looks like those are all of the questions we have. We are ending a little bit early. We'll stay on the line for another minute or so, just to make sure that in case we get any other questions. But as we're closing out, I just wanted to say we're really excited about this work. We're happy to take any questions or any follow-ups. So if you are interested in hearing more, feel free to give me an email at the address you see on the screen, esandmeyer@hadaway.com. We've got one more question, so we can take that before we go. We've done any research in the Midwest? Yeah, we did a couple, our research looked across the country. We had some interviews in Minneapolis, as well as in Pine Ridge. And I think we were able to get a pretty good range of insights in all of those areas.
And in other work, if you're asking in general, have we done research on other topics in general, we have done that in the Midwest and all across the country and other countries as well.
Yes, we are recording this webinar to answer one more question, and we can make it available after the fact. Feel free to just email me, again, at the email address you see on the screen, and I can send that along. Okay, great.
So no more questions. Thank you all very much. Feel free to email Ellie with any questions or requests, and keep up the great work.